Equipping protectors with passion. That's how we operate, and it's how we live. We understand that having the right gear can mean the difference between life and death. Our goal is to get you the gear you need, when you need it, at prices you can afford. This holiday season, listeners receive 10% off now through December 31st with promo code PR10. Visit officerstore.com. Hey, welcome back to Policing Matters on policeone.com. I'm your host, Jim Dudley. Thanks for listening, and be sure and check us out on the YouTube channel, or if you're watching the YouTube channel, go switch over to audio and get a workout in or take a walk and listen to the broadcast. Well, got a great one for you today. Who's looking out for small agencies and rural departments? Well, when you hear about policing in the news, it's usually about big cities, about headlines, about drugs and gangs and immigration and all the national debates on those issues. I came from San Francisco. We had a 16B with $1 billion budget, and we had the resources to tackle most of the challenges. But what about the small towns and rural departments, the places where officers are underpaid, overworked, and often rolling out to calls with outdated gear or no backup for miles? Or maybe they have to buy their own gear. Well, who's speaking up for them? Well, from the Small and Rural Law Enforcement Agency website, I found that nearly half of all local law enforcement agencies in the US have fewer than 10 sworn officers. 3 out of 4 agencies have less than 25 sworn officers or deputies, and 9 out of 10 agencies have less than 50 sworn officers or deputies. And further, according to a report from the Bureau of Justice Statistics, approximately 70% of agencies serve communities of fewer than 10,000 population. Over 90% of local law enforcement agencies employ fewer than 50 sworn and serve populations of less than 50. Well, the U.S. Census Bureau estimates that 97% of America consists of rural areas. Well, because these areas are faced with the unique challenges, law enforcement may face complications in these areas and issues that their counterparts in big cities and urban areas do not. Well, these problems can put a strain on rural police departments, making their jobs that more difficult. Well, today we're joined by someone who speaks up for the small and rural agency. She's an award-winning journalist, a colleague of mine, the 2025 Neal Award recipient for law enforcement writing, and the voice behind the Rural Badge blog. You may know her as Charlie Pitt, but her real name is Kathleen Diaz, and she's here to shine a light on the unsung heroes of rural policing. Well, welcome back to Policing Matters, Kathleen Diaz.
Thank you so much, Jim. It's a privilege to be here.
Well, I'm honored by having you here again. We talk in general terms. We write about police agencies and all the things that are happening to them, but we often forget about these small agencies. You heard the numbers. Right now, we don't usually do age-specific shows, but I mean, it's been a while now. We're in a government shutdown, and rural agencies may be feeling the strain as well. Let's talk about the funding crisis for a little bit. When the government shuts down, we see about headlines, national parks closing down, federal workers being furloughed. What does this mean for rural police and sheriff's departments?
Funding-wise, for the short term, it doesn't mean a whole lot because most of grant cycles are finished for the year. And that is one of the main ways that they would be getting funding from the federal government. So some of it's going to matter whether that funding is there again the next time, not just for things like vest grants and stuff like that, but also things like some of the anti-terrorism training and things like that that was available for small agencies at no cost has pretty much been shut down. I've been told by a couple people it is still a going concern. But when I've gone to their website, the last training I saw was one single virtual workshop in January. And that was all. And those are some things that small sheriffs and chiefs have used to get their guys like explosives training or arson, things like that. I imagine there's going to be some similar constraints on some like TAC med training that has been offered in the past by the marshal's office. Unless the government shutdown continues long enough that what they call the PILT, you know what funds are? The
Hmm.
payments in lieu of taxes, that especially out west, where so much land is publicly owned, it heavily impacts tax bases. And they're going to be dependent on Congress to get their stuff together and get those pipelines filled again. Um, right now, for the short term, though, the local law enforcement shouldn't be too terribly impacted. One exception might be if they are in one of the areas that is near the borders of national forest or national parks, things like that, where the population can triple or grow by 10 times every Friday as people pour in to recreate, because right now there is not a lot of staffing going on there.
Yeah, I just noticed on one of your blogs that relationship of staffing for these federal parks and rangers
Yeah.
that have gone from, the last 20 years as populations grown, the number of deputies and federal rangers has gone way down. I was just in the Lake Tahoe area over the last weekend, and I noticed and I thought about it. One of the state parks, I saw the county sheriff in there going through, um, the transit hub and parking lots, and I was thinking, wow, anybody bordering Yosemite, any of those three counties are probably handling some duties that would otherwise fall to those federal rangers.
They may where they can, but the jurisdictions don't overlap. And if it's federal property, those deputies are not going to have the authority to enforce federal law. So, they can do what they would normally be doing anyway, but they can't take the place of those law enforcement rangers. And it's not just the law enforcement rangers mostly are still working because as law enforcement, they are essential.
Okay.
And so far from what they've told me, they haven't, no, rangers, Forest Service law enforcement, BLM rangers, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, which are basically federal game wardens. So far, most of them have let me know that they are still being paid. The problem is nearly all of the support staff has been furloughed. And there aren't very many of them, many of the actual like sworn law enforcement officers in any of these properties. So, the parks, the administration has insisted on the parks remaining open, but no one is there to take fees.
Mhm.
And they may or may not be cleaning bathrooms and emptying trash cans and all of the sorts of things that the public depends on but don't really think about.
Mhm.
Even the law enforcement rangers, not for law enforcement capabilities, but they rely on even biologists and interpretive rangers to be present and be extra eyes, with say a band of hikers who takes on a trail that's going to be way over their head. They can advise them that, you don't have nearly enough water. Your footwear is not appropriate for the footing you're going to be encountering and stuff like this, but they're not the ones who are ultimately going to be doing the rescue or have the authority to turn them around and say, you can't be here or this area is closed, not to mention what it's doing to their funding. Part of that post there on the Facebook page was noting that the national parks, both with the fees that they take in and the money they generate in the surrounding communities, what visitors spend there, it's something like 18 times overall what the federal funding costs. That's an enormous return on that investment, and a lot of it is just being allowed to slip through everyone's fingers right now.
Yeah, and when we look at staffing in urban areas, it's usually like 3 officers per 1,000, something like
Yeah.
that. But we see half that in these rural areas. Tell me a little bit about what you're hearing. I know you hear from a lot of these officers and deputies from small areas. They handle a high risk call in these unusual conditions, miles away from backup. What are they doing to help mitigate a situation where you might otherwise rush in? I mean, they're probably the original de-escalators, I'd imagine.
They really are. There's the old adage, the one, one riot, one ranger.
Yeah,
And it's only kind of a joke. My husband's retired from very remote areas, and he would use the William Tell overture for the ringtone on his phone. And it was kind of a joke, but it was kind of true. And most of them, yeah, will tell you. I've had some great comment threads and discussions going on the idea that I would rather talk to you for as long as it takes than fight you for 5 minutes by myself.
sure.
And building relationships within the community wherever you can. You can't always, but sometimes you'll be able to establish their kind of relationships where somebody's girlfriend or mom or grandma will call you and say, so and so has a warrant and he's here at my house and I don't want anybody getting hurt. Can you come and work this out? And it's worth maintaining that relationship in the community to do that. They will come up with super imaginative ways sometimes to really just use their words rather than fighting. And they will honestly take a little more time with that sort of thing where, the city guys might be like, you know what, there's 10 of us here already and we could have 30 if we ask.
Mhm.
So, there's that might not be available in the entire county with every agency from federal on down there. So you might take things a little more slowly. You might choose your words a little more carefully. You might work on relationships with, I know your kid plays baseball with my kid. We go to the same church. My mom goes to the same church as your mom. I mean, it sounds kind of cliched. And if you're from a big city, it's probably something you've only seen on TV, but law enforcement does look differently when there's only one grocery store in town and you don't have a choice about where you shop and your kid goes to school with the kids of everyone you've ever arrested. And that's their reality in a lot of places.
Yeah, no, I totally get what you're saying. Hey, recently I hosted a webinar on police vehicle maintenance and fleet and all that. And I took one of your photos. I asked you, and you said yes. And it was a real in-service sheriff's deputy's car tire with just about a hole worn through it. Not quite yet, but right there. I mean, you could count the rings to
Yep.
where it's going to explode. And I use that to show that these are real. There are still vehicles driving around in 2025 in this shape. It was so striking, right? Rural officers are stuck with subpar equipment sometimes. How are they addressing these challenges? I mean, I know they're not throwing up their hands and saying, hey, I'm just not going out.
They don't usually have that option. And it's interesting because that picture and one other of the same tire came to me at via my inbox, a direct message on Facebook, one of my regulars. And he said, these are my tires from my patrol vehicle. And my sheriff knew the condition because I sent him the pictures before he had to take the tire off because it blew up. And the answer he received was, it is not time to change the tires yet. So
Incredible.
basically, when it comes up on the calendar and the budget is there, then we will replace the tires. With really zero accounting for the risk or the liability involved. And there were a lot of people commenting, well, I just would refuse to take that out. And the reality is that a lot of departments in most states, I won't say most, a great many states, don't have that option because the laws there establish that they work at will. They can be fired for anything. And so that again is kind of the big city cliche and that you get from TV and movies is, these powerful police unions and, all this kind of stuff. And there really isn't any such a thing. You might have a few FOP lodges and some really, at will states, right to work states, but they're very weak and they usually can't actually do anything for the officer until after the breach has occurred. And
Mm,
to be honest, that is not a whole lot of help. If I speak out, I'm going to get fired. Well, good. When you get fired, call us and we'll step right in there for you and fight that wrongful termination. It's like, and that's super cool. And what do I do for a living in the meantime?
right.
They don't have the authority to take it and get the tires replaced themselves. They don't have access to the money. They don't have access to a contract. Usually a department that small is not going to have, they don't have a motor pool. They don't have their own mechanics. They have contracts with local shops and that sort of thing. And those contracts are established by the city or the county where they work. That's the only place that vehicle can go for work, and the deputy is not authorized to do that thing. And if they're really small enough, they don't even, they're actually exempt from FLSA. So, some of them have been ordered to work under really extraordinary conditions, and they actually have no recourse other than leaving their job in a lot of places.
Yeah. And the salaries aren't great to begin with. And they're asked to work 60, 70, 80 hours. The tire thing, it's not a matter of optics or, cosmetics. It can be really hazardous if you're going at the limit or over on some of these rural roads. You recently wrote about something called the Blythe Ferry incident, similar along those lines. Tell us a little bit about it.
This is something that I know only from news coverage and from more messages from people local to the problem, um, all of whom I keep anonymous, and that's why they are willing to talk to me. This was an episode in a county in Tennessee where a new deputy, who was not local, he had recently moved there from New York State. So he did not grow up in this county. He doesn't know the roads. He doesn't know the area. It's rural. The roads are narrow and they're poorly lit, if they're lit at all. Um, and he had an in custody woman in the back of his car and drove off an old ferry crossing. It's used for a boat launch now. And they both drowned. And it was just absolutely horrific. This lady that was in the back of his car was not a serial murderer or anything. She'd gotten hooked for something fairly minor. And the more I read about it and the more I have been reading the documents attached with new lawsuits that are coming out by the family of the in custody, this young deputy's FTO program was basically non-existent. He was supposed to have 2 weeks of quote unquote ride along with a more senior deputy. That was the FTO program. So he was a new academy grad. He'd only been working there, I want to say, about 7 weeks. He had 2 weeks, which, is only what shifts that a senior officer is on. So it was not a full, even 14 days, as if that might be enough. And the conditions in the lawsuit are also now asserting that he was driving an old Crown Vic without a functioning odometer, without any functioning navigation equipment. And again, he doesn't know the area. He's new to there. And some of the pictures that I shared with that, I just pulled off of Google, and it shows this old ferry crossing is black asphalt that goes straight into the river, and there's still a double yellow on it as if it were a road. So he's driving roads in the dark. It was apparently foggy that night. And honestly doesn't know what speed he's going because his odometer doesn't work. The deputies were, according to the documents in this lawsuit, told to text for communication when radios failed because the radio coverage is really spotty. And that's not unusual in a place that is hilly. There's like no such thing as line of sight in a lot of these places. And I understand that. But one of the things that's really been a big deal on social media and in news coverage around that, well, he was texting while he was driving. Well, that's what he was told to do because his radio doesn't work. And he was apparently using his own navigation equipment I don't know whether it was a program on the phone or something else, but the lawsuit was also saying that Garmin showed a non-existent bridge there.
Mm.
And so as if it were a literal crossing. And so, I mean, it's just an absolute perfect storm of disastrousness. And, this new guy and his family are taking the brunt of it. And I don't see how anybody could make a case that most of that in any location wouldn't be avoidable with nothing, if nothing else, keep him with a senior officer long enough to learn the roads, to learn, everybody's like, well, everybody knows that's there. Well, yeah, if you grew up, you would, if you grew up there. But if you moved there from another state recently and it's dark and it's foggy, maybe not. Just kind of a mess. And the case has not come to court yet, so there's no resolve. But it's really not the sort of thing you would see usually in a larger city where, I know even in California, even in smaller agencies, they have, very tightly prescribed FTO programs. And, you go to the academy, and I've never even heard of an FTO program that was shorter than 4 months. And that's usually with multiple instructors and multiple shifts and different conditions. And that's the whole point, not just being evaluated, but learning local culture and learning geography and, that sort of stuff.
Yeah, what a tragedy. Well, hopefully they've done some things since then, put up a fence or something, or gosh, some signage. But like you say, perfect storm, and all of it was avoidable. All of it could have been avoided. But we talk about the limitations of equipment and officers using their own equipment, doing these sort of ad hoc maneuvers using the text by phone rather than a radio that won't work. Just awful.
Well, and I don't see how it's necessary. I don't. Um, you know, I am an advocate for rural officers and small departments, but I do have to say that what you've always done isn't working anymore. And this is the richest nation in the world. This is the 21st century, and it's time to stop doing the work as if it's 1945.
Yeah.
This is not that world anymore. It's time to make a different plan if that's the case.
Yeah, I'm working under conditions just because of the local economy. We do have a Department of Justice, and maybe some of the monies that we could have saved on some of these 20, 30-year consent decrees could be going to agencies like that.
And maybe some people need to unbend and let go of a tad of local control and consolidate resources with some of the other small agencies nearby. Nobody likes to do that,
Hmm.
because nobody likes to not do things the way they've always done. But if your only other option is to let people drive dangerous vehicles without appropriate training, things like that, I'm just not seeing how that's working anymore.
Yeah. Well, reading some of the stuff that you're writing about and my own personal experience, I did a ride along, and I was consulting with a Washington State Sheriff's Office, riding along with deputies on these dirt roads out in the middle of nowhere. And I'd ask them, like, what are you doing for backup? Are you trying to talk your way out of it? Are you just standing off till 20, 30 minutes so you get back up? And they said, there's so many good neighbors and people who know you that they will come to your aid, or they'll tell you, hey, so and so's been acting up, or I've heard gunshots over there today. Be careful. So you've got communities that are looking out for these deputies. What are you hearing out there?
In a lot of cases, that is true. And that goes back to cultivating those relationships in a way that may not even be possible in a more highly populated area because
Mm.
you can't meet enough people in the day. You got to get out of the vehicle, you have to talk to people. You have to establish that you have to work at it. But a lot of times you will find that people can be they can be a lot of help. They live there. They want it to be a nice place to live. And it doesn't mean everybody, one of the hashtags I use all the time is Mayberry's a myth. Because no, it's not that little imaginary, little community that's sweet and loving and wants everything good for all people just because it's small. But it doesn't mean that there aren't an awful lot of really good people out there, and you want them on your side. And I know one of the suggestions a trainer I interviewed a while ago had said is get get local people, as many as you can, anywhere they live, to take stop the bleed classes. You
Yeah.
know, it's very basic. It's free. He says, I've trained 8-year-olds, and he was talking about, he had a grandpa man who was a farmer who came to one of his Stop the Bleed classes, and his 8-year-old granddaughter tagged along because he was daycare that day. And so he taught her too. And when at the end of the class, he gave her a tourniquet too and said, Papa hurts himself. You can help. Farm work is dangerous. And if they might be the first ones on scene, it beats the daylights out of your golden hour ticking away all by yourself where you're waiting for the official help to get there. That's one of the ways that local people absolutely can help. And it's pretty minimal investment. And I would say another way is for them to find out what is really going on with their law enforcement agencies, not just what they see, you see them out on a traffic stop or whatever, but what is really going on and what do they need, if they're in a place where, in some states, you'll find a huge disparity between the retirement and disability systems available to an officer working in a relatively wealthy city. And I don't
Mhm.
mean wealthy like fancy. I just mean like they have a viable tax base compared to the one with 3,000 people in it. Um, you can lobby for changes for them, and it gets the appearance of conflict out of it. The officers can advocate for themselves, and they should, and their families should. Although, having been law enforcement family, I understand that, especially as a spouse, you sometimes feel muzzled and that you ought not to speak up to not attract negative attention. But your neighbor could,
Mm.
whether it's calling city council and saying, hey, next time this comes up in a meeting, it's worth it to me to pay an extra $5 on, my sales taxes over the course of the year. If everybody is doing it too, and that means that you guys can buy into a better disability system when somebody does get hurt, because they will, that those things don't just happen in big cities. And the regular public does have the ability to do that. Or if it's something that needs to be done at the state level, get on the phone, get on the email, look up your reps, find out who's in charge, and tell them what you want and how you expect them to do it. Their voice carries a lot of weight as a voter.
Yeah, well, hold that thought because I want to talk about support, funding, other programs for these areas. But first, I want to take a moment and thank our sponsor, Officer Store, equipping protectors with passion. That's how we operate, and it's how we live. We understand that having the right gear can mean the difference between life and death. Our goal is to get you the gear you need, when you need it, at prices you can afford. Visit us at officerstore.com. And we're back, and I'm speaking with Kathleen Diaz, the voice of the Rural Badge, shining a spotlight on rural policing. Kathleen, we are just talking a little bit about funding for these agencies. And, truth be told, how effective can a 3, 4, 5 person department be? I mean, it's a whole nother can of worms. I think you and I discussed it before, but um, they're not working 24/7, and you just wonder about the effectiveness. But in these small hamlets, maybe in the middle of these large rural areas, people want to know that they've got regular folks they can count on to handle problems, that know the area and things like that. Any wise words about whether or not we should keep these small departments or just ask the local sheriff's office to cover?
I think for the meantime, we are going to keep all of the small departments. because it is what has always been done. And I think as things change over time, and because we're seeing a lot of small departments simply fold under the pressure of finances and not recruiting but retention, they can almost always hire,
Yeah.
but you can't always get people to continue to work under those conditions. I think we may see more consolidation, and that is one potential solution. Depending on the size of the area and the financial support that they get. And I know everybody wants to say, no, it doesn't just come down to money, but the fact is some things just do. Um, I I know that they can be effective, but there are limitations, and the people in the communities need to understand that. One of the things the officers in small agencies can do, and actually the officers themselves can't do all of it. And that needs to be department heads working together and establishing MOUs for backing each other up, especially back east where jurisdiction is a thing. That was something I had to learn because in California, it was not really a thing. All law enforcement officers who are sworn have police powers throughout the state. And I have since learned that no, that is not in fact the case in a lot of places, especially back east. So if you're going to have a pursuit that leaves, the county line or leaves the city limits or whatever, and you're going to need backup or to hand that pursuit off to someone else, and now you become the backup, you have to have established that relationship in writing, formally, legally, before it becomes a problem. And that's a place where forward thinking can make it, maybe it is a really small department, but especially where distances are closer back east, maybe there's another really small department just 5 miles away. And that sort of stuff. And it's like, 5 miles is kind of a ways to wait for backup, but it's definitely not the longest distance, and it's better than none if you already have established that working relationship.
Mhm. Now let's talk a little bit about the 1033 program. So the military surplus program, we've seen it come and go. We've seen some really great training programs that were funded and then unfunded. And I think the 1033 program's been back where agencies can claim surplus military equipment. And usually they're talking about things like armored vehicles or sniper rifles or Kevlar, something, along the larger lines. What are you hearing that agencies are doing to be strategic in accessing 1033?
Those things are still definitely in play. And if you can afford a Bearcat, it's definitely better than an old up armored Humvee. But the up armored Humvee beats the daylights out of that old Crown Vic if that's what you can get. Maintenance is a problem and they're really slow, but still, they've saved a lot of lives. But some of the best advice that I think I've seen from a small town police chief on my Facebook page wrote me a long piece saying, do with it what you want, but this is what I've been doing. And the guy was just absolutely a logistical genius. And he was advising other department heads of small agencies to really root through that list of what counts as military surplus, because it's not just vehicles and body armor and stuff like this. And it was like, why is SWAT wearing camo? It's because it's free. That's why. But he's just like, I got toilet paper. I got printer paper. I replaced my printer that was dying. And he's like, no, this is not riches, but every $300 for a year's worth of printer paper I don't have to spend, I can spend to do something else. And he was like, if you multiply that out enough and you do it every year, it's not a huge source of money, but when your source of money is already pretty constrained, he was making a difference in his budget that way, and it's like, I gotta admire that.
Yeah, that's pretty smart. Let's talk a little bit about a project you've been working on. I've been reading about it. I think you mentioned that you've been working on this for 7 years, tracking shootings of law officers in these rural areas. What are you seeing a pattern? Are they on the rise, or did we fix it? What's going on?
I wish we fixed it. Yeah, this is my 7th year of tracking As closely as I can find them, all officers shot within the United States. What's different about the project I work on is I break it down by where they got shot. So I don't care what agency they work for, and so that's like with Leoka, the federal database. Um, it breaks out like federal officers differently from county and city and stuff like that. And I find it a little hard to put together when the big picture I'm looking for isn't whom, it's where. I want to know where they got hurt because the stereotype is always, the super gritty urban jungle full of risk and danger. And, this is out in the country. And I've actually been told by people, and I've had officers tell me that they've been turned down for things that they have asked for, whether it's upgraded armor, or armor at all, or certain kinds of training, because, and I quote, things like that don't happen here, unquote. And so my goal was to demonstrate that, yes, this most clearly does happen here, wherever here is, because the risk factor is not a location, it's people. And so over the course of the years, and I've written about this for every police week for the past 6 years in Police One, and I break down the previous year's numbers in each one of those. So you can go back and look for, May of each year and see how those numbers go. And the pattern always seems to go like this. I really thought I was imagining it because that is my bias toward looking at rural law enforcement things. But there will be usually around 300 or so officers each year who get shot nationwide. And then I break it down by communities that are between 11,000 and 30,000 population and below 11,000. And overall, the numbers tend to go quite a ways down with that between 11 and 30,000. And then you get to the really small communities from just a couple people up to 11,000, and the numbers actually go way up.
Hmm.
And so there has never been a year that I've been tracking this where the percentage of officers shot and killed in small places, the places I write about, has been less than 25 to 30%. Not last year, but the year before, so 2023, it got up to 56%. And then it fell back down in the 30s last year. I just ran a total yesterday because I knew we'd be talking about this. And it was back up at 51% of
Hmm.
the fatalities of officers who died by felonious gunfire are in the places that I write about this year. And that completely takes that stereotype and tips it on its head. And it absolutely flies in the face of anybody in a small county or a small town who would use that justification to discourage or deny appropriate training, appropriate equipment, radios that work for these officers. And it's really hard to contain unless you see it all in one place like that, because an officer who gets hurt in a town of, 500 people, that makes local news. It does not make national news. Even if it's a multi-casualty event like the one that happened in Kentucky in 2022, that might have made national news for 2 or 3 days. And
Hmm.
then it disappears. And when you look at something like, the North Hollywood bank robbery, that's still in the news. It happened in the 90s. And they they need the numbers to get the work done that they need. And I want to provide that. And I'm an amateur. I'm not a professional statistician. I'm not a professional researcher. So I'm just documenting it. I'm just counting. I'm marking it. I'm making sure that they're seen. And I keep hoping that someone bigger and smarter than me will come along and see all these numbers and go, oh, wow, maybe we should do something about that. I'm not sure what that thing would be yet, but I know that saying, I'm going to gamble with your life on the off chance that that probably won't happen here is not a good plan.
Yeah, it would be really interesting to break it down and see what the officer's doing at the time, where he is around the
Hmm.
vehicle, and if the other person's a hunter or somebody who's just carrying a gun, they're not a criminal or a regular armed criminal like you would think. It's funny you mentioned the Hollywood bank robbery. That's the first thing I thought about in an
Yep.
urban setting.
Yep.
But I mean, you might be coming across poachers or other people, uh, you know, doing whatever in the wild, and they've got not only firearms but really high-powered, accurate firearms.
Well, and that is one of the things. It's like another statistic that I have come across when I'm doing this research is that game wardens, however few they are statistically much more likely to be assaulted than almost any other uniformed officer per capita. And everyone that they contact, except maybe I guess some fishermen, is armed.
Hmm.
And one of the other things that I have noticed when a game warden gets shot, whether they survive or whether they don't, the penalties are often very low for the shooter because they nearly always maintain that they didn't know it was a game warden or they thought he was a deer. Happens all the time, and it's almost impossible to prove otherwise.
Mm.
And so sometimes, even with an officer who survives devastating injuries or is killed, you might get anything from probation to 6 or 7 years for a penalty.
Wow.
It's treated very, very differently than shooting a different kind of law enforcement officer.
Yeah. Wow. What a shame. So you're hearing from multiple sources, social media, response back from some of the articles that you write. What are you hearing? Is there a pattern or a trend these days that rural officers are talking about?
It really seems in rural places, and you feel like you're saying the same thing over and over again. The budget constraints are just really, really brutal. And as prices go up, things that were already hard, like vehicle maintenance, get even harder.
Mm-hmm.
Um, some states have a really hard time with getting officers from smaller departments through their police academies. There are a few states that really like only have one approved academy, and so there's always a waiting list.
Mm-hmm.
And it just that those sorts of things don't get easier. There's a couple of chiefs and sheriffs that I've talked to that have found some really innovative ways to keep their recruiting and retention high, but those guys are almost always real fighters for their people, even if they're risking their jobs and they're willing to do that, and that makes a huge difference. Healthcare costs are one of the things that are just really brutal. Most departments anymore do not pay for dependent healthcare. So they will pay for all or more often part of the officer's premium, and then dependents can buy in. It is usually not affordable to do so. And, I've even talked to one sheriff in a plain state who told me flat out he doesn't take his insulin, he can't afford it. And
Wow.
that's the sheriff, that's not a deputy.
Yeah.
So, and honestly, that's something that we experienced ourselves in California in the small department where my husband worked, and I know that that has not improved, and I can't figure out what the solution to that would be. um,
Yeah. And elsewhere in large departments, we're talking about things like wellness programs and watching our diet and our sleep and our fitness and all that. And then you have something like a sheriff who cannot afford insulin.
yeah.
That's disgraceful. Hey, I want to be mindful of your time. I know you're always busy writing, rooting out a story, or, you know, turning something around really quickly with the rural badge. You do incredible work. What's next for you? What are you writing about right now?
One of the stories I'm working on right now is on those differences in retirements. So I am looking at Kentucky's retirement system with the difference between the hazardous and non-hazardous designations. And so that's also made me broaden out my reach. I've put out a few phone calls to guys I've talked with before. One of them is with New York's Department of Environmental Conservation, which is what they call their conservation officers or game wardens, because there have been a lot of disparities there, as there have been in California, with they've got the game wardens or California game wardens who are state law enforcement officers, but there are a ton of things that are not available to them. In New York, it's things like being able to retire at 20 years, like state troopers can. In California, one of the big issues has been presumptive injuries and illnesses that are a given for other departments, even in some cases, like, university police acknowledge PTSD as a presumptive illness or injury. Game wardens don't. Melanoma is not a presumptive illness for game wardens in California, despite the fact that they spend their entire career outdoors. So those sorts of things that I don't think the public is 100% aware of, that these kind of disparities that, they say it's a cop's a cop. And it's like, no, there's getting to be kind of a caste system. And I find it to be a problem. And so that's one of the things that I've been working on, especially today. So.
Yeah, well, that's a noble endeavor. Thanks for what you do for rural officers all over across the country, small agencies, bringing these issues to light. And hopefully we got some community support, maybe some legislative support, something that we could do to help these officers do their job with dignity. Thanks so much, Kathleen Diaz, for sharing your time with us today.
I always appreciate the invitation, Jim. Thank you.
Yeah, so great to hear from you. And to our listeners, if you haven't checked out the Rural Badge, you can see the link in our show notes. Check it out. Check out some of her archived articles. And she's an award winner. They're great, and people are noticing them. Check it out at theruralbadge.com. All right. And to our listeners, let me know what you think. Drop me a line at policingmatters@policeone.com. Let me know what's going on in your neck of the woods. And if you've got some stories to pass on to Kathleen, you can do them directly on her website, or you can send them to me and I'll get them to her as well. All right. So thanks for listening. Thanks for watching. And I hope you're doing good and staying safe. And I hope to talk to you again real soon. Take good care.